Hey, everybody. Well, welcome. It's nice to see everyone again. Welcome to the second workshop in the academic tradecraft series, which is going to take place over the course of the year. I'm Mark Goodale, Leverhulme Trust, a visiting professor in the School of Anthropology at the University of Oxford this year. And what I'm going to do is introduce again, for the last time, the logic of this seminar. And then I'm going to give my introduction to the theme for this week. So the logic of academic tradecraft is to organize a series of workshops for junior colleagues, staff, students, and others here at the University of Oxford, but also available more generally around skills, capabilities that are learned over the long term through experience. What you might think of as the elusive skills that are part of an academic career. Some of these skills involve things like writing and publication, and others are more personal. How to deal with disappointment in academia, the importance of developing a philosophy of an academic career. So there are going to be 6 workshops over the course of the year. This is the second. There'll be 2 more workshops in the second term and 2 in the final term at the University of Oxford. So what I do for these workshops is I give an introduction for roughly 15 minutes, which is recorded, and after which we end the recording and have a roundtable discussion for the remainder of the workshop. Okay, so let me start with the theme for today. So the title for today's workshop is Jargon, Allusion, Enumeration, and Declaration. And what I want to do is I want to talk a little bit about very specific questions of writing. Now, as academics, we talk very generally about writing a lot, or maybe to greater or lesser degrees. And it's very clear that we spend a lot of time writing. And I think an argument can be made that an academic, after a number of years in your career, ends up writing in an extraordinary number of genres. We write articles, we write books, we write book chapters, we write grant applications, we write encyclopedia entries, we write letters of recommendation. There's a vast spectrum of genres of writing that academics have to master or learn how to do to one extent or another. And yet, despite the fact that academics tend to write a lot over the course of the career, over a wide range of genres, there's a lot about writing which is left unsaid. And even though in the last academic tradecraft workshop, I talked about revise and resubmit and specific questions around the revise and resubmit process, trying to, in a way, excavate to bring up some of the questions in that area, there's still many other things about writing which are not really discussed formally. So part of what I want to do in this introduction in this workshop today is to, in a way, surface some of those things which are left unsaid, and also to make a broader argument that academics should spend more time thinking, talking about, discussing, considering questions of writing at very specific, very granular levels. And the reason I think about this is because I happen to be married to someone who identifies as a writer and a poet. And when I followed her career, her life over the last 24 years, what I've noticed is that in that world, in the world of poetry and creative writing and literature, they talk about writing a lot. They workshop their writing. They talk about sentence structure. They talk about the use of punctuation. All of those things get considered in the realm of creative writing. And in some ways, you might say that they spend more time talking about writing than actually writing itself, which is probably a good thing. And it reminds me of that line by Oscar Wilde, and I don't know, I can't remember it exactly, but something to the effect of, he talked about how he would spend an entire morning deciding whether to put a comma into a sentence, and then spend the rest of the afternoon deciding whether to take the comma out. Now, of course, if we as academics were focused on the craft of writing at that level, we never would be able to do the kind of writing that we do, especially the extent of writing. But nevertheless, the argument is that we should spend more time considering the craft of writing as academics. And if you think about the scholars, the writers that you admire, I'm an anthropologist, but this applies more widely. Why is it that you admire the work that they do, the work that you engage with? It could be because of the ideas that they're associated with. It could be the interesting projects. But also, I would imagine that it's the kind of writing that you encounter because you engage with scholars, you engage with other researchers, other people in your field, largely through their writing. Sometimes it's through lectures, sometimes it's through conferences, but it's largely through the publications, which means it's largely through the writing. And even though it might be the ideas, the theoretical frameworks, or very interesting projects, I would say that it's probably also the writing style, the way in which writing, academic writing can be or not compelling, that also plays a role in why you admire the people who you engage with. So another thing I want to say just preliminarily before I talk about sort of 4 issues, jargon, allusion, enumeration, and declaration, is that you might find it useful, or we might find it useful to draw a distinction between the aspects of academic writing which are spontaneous and the aspects of academic writing which are much more intentional. And it's not one or the other. I would say it's a sort of spectrum from spontaneity to sort of super hyper intentional kind of writing. And what I mean by that is when you've outlined a piece of, you've outlined something you're going to write, an article, a book, whatever it is, you have an outline in a book, on your computer, wherever you do your outline, you're prepared. But then at some point you sit in front of your screen, unless there are some people who actually still write longhand, but you sit in front of your screen, you put your fingers on the keyboard, and something spontaneous happens. You have to then go from the outline to the spontaneous creative act of academic writing, because at that level, what we do is in a way no different than what my wife does and people who write novels and all kinds of other creative writing. Academic and especially qualitative social scientific writing, including anthropological writing, is intensely creative. So there's an act of spontaneity which takes place in front of the screen. So you have your draft, the draft then is ready to be revised, and it's at that moment where the writing, the craft of writing becomes less and less spontaneous and more intentional. And you can follow that out all the way to, in some cases, multiple years. If you're writing a book, it might be 2 to 3 years before the book is published, and sometime before that where you might have your final page proofs. So now you're going back and you're reading, revising your own writing, which was produced years ago in that spontaneous moment, as a very detached reviewer, very detached. It's a bizarre process. And it's certainly in those moments, as the writing becomes more and more intentional, where you're able to make more and more intentional decisions about certain kinds of things to do or not do, certain kind of things to experiment with or not to experiment with in your writing. So that's one thing to say. So what I'm going to talk about today, or in this introduction, are more the kind of decisions that one might make as the writing becomes more and more intentional. And what I would say in general is that this argument that I'm making is less about the how of writing, how to organize your life, how to manage your time so that you find the space to write. Do you write in the morning? Do you write in the afternoon? How to write even if you're teaching. It's not so much about the how of writing, which we do talk about, but it's more about the specific what of writing, specific things about sentence construction, about voice, about tone. Do you use the passive voice? Do you put yourself at the center of your academic narrative? Things like that. So this is really about the what of writing. Okay, so in order to do this in a somewhat brief way, I've chosen 4 categories which are in the title of this workshop. This is jargon, allusion, enumeration, and declaration. I'm going to talk through each of these in turn. What do they mean, and what are their implications for what I've just called the intentional academic writing? Okay, so let me start with jargon. Now, jargon is one of the most common things we hear as academics, one of the most common categories. And I would say it's almost always encountered in a negative way. You almost always encounter the phrase jargon or reference to jargon in relation to academic writing in a negative way. Avoid jargon, or a journal might say that this journal tries to avoid jargon in its articles, or you should try and write in a jargon-free way. So there's this definite negative sense of jargon. But what exactly is jargon? This is a question. What exactly is it? I think it's worth breaking it down, unpacking, as we might say, the idea of jargon. And in doing so, I think what you'll see, or what I would argue, is that there are actually some moments in which there's a positive face of jargon, or positive side of jargon that you might intentionally use. So let's go back to what is jargon. So what is jargon? Jargon, they can be words, or they can be phrases. And they're typically, and I'll start with the kind of negative sense of jargon. In the negative sense, words or phrases are used as a kind of shorthand. And I'll tell you in a minute what I mean by shorthand, but let me just give you some examples of jargon. Now, I'm drawing from anthropology, and some of this is going to date me because what becomes jargon changes over time. But when I was coming up as an anthropologist, you know, Foucault was all the rage. And so various terms which are translated from the French, like disciplinarity or biosociality and so on, became phrases or words which were used in a way that we would call jargon in the negative sense. In other words, shorthand for something, which I'll get to. But other words would be things like global, combining the global and the local. Other words which could be considered jargon, or which are often encountered as jargon in this shorthand way, would be things like affordances, ruination, post-human. And you have phrases which in some cases combine two jargon words, or words that are used as jargon, to create a kind of double whammy of jargon. And I came across, reviewing a piece recently, the use of the phrase post-human affordances. So when I say a shorthand, and in this sense, I agree with the council to not use jargon in your writing in this sense, is that it's a shorthand or a shortcut for a proper argument. In other words, if in the development of your piece of writing, you're making an argument, as you should make an argument, and you're using these words or these phrases as a kind of shortcut to what should be a more developed, well-elaborated, coherent, clear, concise argument, then in that sense, the use of jargon in your writing should be avoided. And it should be avoided for a number of reasons, not the least of which, as a reviewer, and as I mentioned in the last workshop, when you become more senior in your academic career, you might end up reviewing hundreds of journal manuscripts, book manuscripts, proposals, and so on. So you see how jargon gets used in writing. It tends to antagonize reviewers who want to rightly see you make an argument in a more elaborated, proper way, and not to use disciplinarity or ruination or biosociality or post-human affordances, etc., as a shortcut to what you should be doing. So in that sense, you should avoid jargon. But there is another face of jargon, which is what we might think of as the positive face of jargon, in which it might involve the exact same words: disciplinarity, biosociality, whatever it is. And that's when you use it as a shorthand, not a shortcut, a shorthand to what we might call gestural acknowledgement, which itself might be a kind of jargony way of discussing, of talking about this. But what I mean by a gestural acknowledgement is, in the part of your writing in which you are, in a sense, developing an intellectual history, positioning your argument, your properly made argument, it is perfectly appropriate to use disciplinarity, ruination, biosociality, whatever it is in your particular field, to sort of make a gesture toward an intellectual history, which does the work of acknowledging that intellectual history, which is acceptable in the course of your writing, without having to go and then explain in detail exactly what disciplinarity means and how it applies to your proper argument. So jargon, terms, phrases have a place in writing when they're being used in this positive sense. And I would say, in a way, the positive face of jargon is just an accepted way in which we develop arguments and context in the course of our academic writing. It's something which is not to be avoided, but it's actually expected. So the first category I wanted to talk about and introduce in this what of writing is jargon. So the second is allusion, not illusion. Now, there could also be a place for illusion in one's academic writing, but here I want to talk about allusion, a way of associating, of connoting something without referring to it directly or explicitly. It's a way of softening a point, softening a reference, but to do so intentionally. This is what I mean by allusion in your academic writing. And the reason I mention this is because in a recent work, my last book, published in 2022, Reinventing Human Rights, there were moments in the book in which I intentionally used allusion in different kinds of ways. And what I mean is that in proposing, in this case, an anthropological alternative to the existing human rights system, what I call reinvented human rights, using the comparative database of ethnographic studies of human rights to suggest, to propose an alternative model for human rights for the future, one that would be organized around social movements and political movements. There are points in the book in which the question arises, or naturally arises, is are there any social movements in the world today which express this alternative model? And I thought about, should I identify, name certain movements and say this movement organizes itself in ways that express perfectly what I mean by reinvented human rights and these don't. And I chose not to do so, mostly for strategic reasons, because I didn't feel at that point that it was necessary to draw myself, to draw those kind of distinctions, those kind of lines. I used phrases like social movements that organize around logics of exclusionary difference as opposed to inclusionary difference would be social movements which don't express a reinvented human rights as I envision, without trying to identify which social movements in the world today do organize arguably around theories of exclusionary difference. So I sort of left it out there for readers to apply or not apply as they wanted to. So there's a kind of strategic way in which you would intentionally use allusion in your academic writing if you don't feel that it's necessary to really confront another author or to confront a body of work in a very direct way, but maybe more in an elusive way, an indirect, a connotation would be a useful writing strategy technique. But there's another reason in which allusion would be useful as a writer, and is useful as a writer. It's less to do with the political or strategic factors and more the intellectual. And that is that when you are making an argument, especially as a qualitative social scientist, as an anthropologist, and others, and this is again my approach. Others will have their own arguments or approaches, but I think that it's useful to articulate arguments in such a way that they are as capacious as possible. In other words, that they are as welcoming as possible to others. Others can imagine their own projects in relation to the argument that you're making in an article or a book. They want to associate perhaps their existing or future work with the argument, with the approach that you're suggesting in your article. And to do that, it is useful to be somewhat indirect in relation to what the implications are of your piece. Again, it's a way of avoiding those exclusionary lines, which are very clear and very direct, and which immediately act to exclude some projects, some approaches, some authors, etc. So again, the allusion could be useful in these intellectual terms by, in a way, making your writing more welcoming, more capacious than it would otherwise be. And here I just was reading a piece from one of my colleagues this year, David Zeitlin, in the department in the School of Anthropology, who has a piece that is called, in the Journal of the Royal Anthropological Institute, that he calls sparsity. And it's a brilliant piece and very similar to what I'm arguing here, in which he talks about how it's important, or it's useful in writing, to be somewhat intentionally sparse. In other words, not trying to do everything or too much in your writing. And it's very similar to what I'm talking about with allusion. He has this wonderful phrase in one of the sections where he talks about gaps. The idea of leaving gaps in our writing, intentionally leaving gaps, as in a way as scary or as unsettling as that might be. Don't be afraid to intentionally leave gaps in your writing for fear of what you won't say, because the implications might be is that it's going to be much more welcoming, much more inviting to people who are reading it. That in a way, it's a little bit like you might think of abstract paintings in a museum. You know, different people bring their own ideas, their own appreciation to a work of abstract painting. Now, academic writing is not an abstract painting. It's not a Rorschach test where everyone can bring whatever they want to it. But there is something interesting in that, leaving a bit of as David would say, some gaps in your writing, intentionally using sparsity or allusion in your writing for these different kinds of reasons. So that's allusion. Now, a third category that I wanted to introduce is enumeration. So what do I mean by enumeration? Enumeration is a way of talking about the way in which academics tend to create lists, numbered lists in our writing. And what are the implications of that? And the reason I identified this as a category is that I realized in going back and, again, at a distance, reading my own writing recently, is that I am a notorious enumerator. You know, I became annoyed with my own enumeration, in the sense that I went back and as I was reading my chapter 4, and let's say in a book, I saw myself starting sections with a phrase like, there are 3 variables which are important for understanding X, Y, and Z, or there are 4 factors which explain X, Y, and Z. First, blah, blah, blah. Second, blah, blah, blah. Third, blah, blah, blah. And finally, blah, blah, blah. So then I go and finish the chapter. Chapter 5, the next chapter. I have my introduction, and then finally I get around to yet another list, another enumeration. There are 4 big factors, and I was doing that throughout the entire book. So it got me thinking, you know, as a reader, even reading your own material, it became a bit repetitive. And I was wondering, why is it that we use enumeration? And I think the answer is because it is just a logical way to structure the points, the arguments that we want to make in an article, a chapter, or something, a longer body of academic writing. And we have evidence, ethnographic, or wherever the evidence is coming from, and we're going to marshal that evidence to make an argument to develop, tell an ethnographic narrative, however you want to see that in a piece of writing. And more often than not, especially in Anglo-American writing, because it's very important to remember that there are definite academic cultural differences here. I work normally at the University of Lausanne in Switzerland, which is a French-speaking university, and my Francophone colleagues have a very different approach. They don't enumerate in that way. In fact, they assiduously avoid enumeration because in the French style of academic writing, to come to the second category, you should be much more elusive as your dominant, let's say, tone or mode that you use in your writing, and that it's insulting to the reader to be too direct and too enumerative in your writing, first, second, third, fourth. The idea and the impact should come out of an overall impact and overall effect of the writing. But for those of us who are writing in English, in a way we're most of us are adopting those Anglo-American or those English conventions. Enumeration is something you're taught and you're seen in a lot in different kinds of writing. And I'm not criticizing enumeration. I think there's an important place for it. But I just wanted to signal what are the consequences of enumeration. And I think that the positive consequences or the positive implications of enumeration, and again, thinking about my own experience, which is what I'm doing throughout this entire workshop, is that when you make a list, when you conceive of a list of 4 variables or 3 variables or whatever it is, it in a way forces you to structure your piece of writing in a way that it wouldn't otherwise do, and to do so in advance. And then, this is maybe more about the how, not the what of writing. Then, in terms of actually doing the writing, it in a way facilitates the process of writing, because you're just in a way following that list of factors or variables, which often constitute the substantive core of a piece of writing. So I think there's absolutely positive implications or benefits to using enumeration. I think in a way, at least taking account of those cultural differences or cultural writing differences, I think it's inevitable to use enumeration in one way or another. However, the kind of negative or other things you want to think about is it does bring repetition and a kind of, it can have a kind of quasi-scientific feel to the writing. It can come across as too definitive, because obviously those are the 3 or 4 variables or elements that you thought about. But even if you yourself were to go back and to write that same piece 2 years later, you might have 3 or 4 other variables. But it sort of presents itself as if those are the 4 variables or the 3 elements and the only 3 elements, which is of course not the case, especially in qualitative social science and anthropology. So that's something to keep in mind. You can also, so I was thinking about what very practically, very specifically, what would be if you're going to use enumeration? And as I said, you have to, I think we can't avoid it. How many elements or variables do you conceive or come up with? And typically, if I think about my own writing, I end up with 3 or 4. It tends to be that there are 3 or there are 4. At least not in anthropological writing, you wouldn't start a section or a chapter with there are 12 variables. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. That would be ridiculous. But you also couldn't say, really, there are 2 variables. That's too few. However, if you do think that if you want to use a more dialectical approach to structuring your writing, you can use on the one hand and on the other. Well, now you just ended up with 2. You've enumerated. It's a kind of shadow enumeration. There are 2 things which you're going to talk about, but you're not using explicitly one or 2. So that is about enumeration. Again, keep in mind it is a definitive way of writing. It's a way of structuring your writing, and I think it's unavoidable and inevitable in structuring complex arguments. But it's something to keep in mind, using perhaps different grammatical or writing techniques to soften the repetition, the repetitiveness. So for example, instead of 1, 2, 3, and finally, you can use things like and another or in addition. So you can end up with your list of 4, but without using the words first, second, third, and fourth. So there are ways that you can soften the repetition and still maintain the benefits of enumeration, which, as I said, I think are inevitable. And then the final category in this introduction to the workshop today is declaration. So declaration is another writing choice. Now remember, all of these categories I'm talking about are categories in your toolkit, your writer's toolkit, which you would bring to bear as the writing becomes more and more intentional. And the 4th tool in your kit is declaration, meaning the use of factual or simple, explicit writing which is as explicit and as direct, as factual as possible. And when would you want to use declarative writing? And here I think of Hemingway, who was a great advocate for declarative writing, in this case in fiction. He has all sorts of essays about writing in which he would encourage people who have writer's block that if you can't actually think of what to say, if you can't start your writing, just write one true thing, one true thing. He also has a wonderful phrase, which I think about a lot, is that the hardest thing in writing is to write one true thing and sometimes write something that's truer than true. What is truer than true? That's something to reflect on. But obviously, and his kind of what you might call declarative writing became a caricature in the end. So, and we as academics making complicated arguments, although there is that adage there, which you will often see alongside the counsel against jargon, is to make your argument as simply as possible. But sometimes it's not possible to make an argument at a very granular sentence by sentence, paragraph by paragraph level in a Hemingway-esque way. It's just impossible to do that. There might be some writers you admire who really do model very declarative writing, even in making complicated arguments, that so often our arguments require a kind of complexity, and especially if, as I've said, you are intentionally using techniques like allusion in your writing. That is going to inevitably inject a sense of complexity, ambiguity, the sparsity, the gaps, but in an intentional way into your writing. And as I mentioned in other writing traditions, like in the French academic tradition, complexity is itself an aesthetic which is highly valued in academic writing. And then, of course, as those of us who are reading and writing also in the English, who've read those works in translation, know that when you then try to translate French or German social theory into English, that complexity then gets compounded, and you find yourself in a graduate seminar somewhere trying to make sense of a piece of translated writing. But leaving that aside, we are sort of working in a more organic way with these different tools of declaration, of allusion, of complexity, simplicity, in a way that is more coherent, let's say. So coming back to declaration, so there are moments and places in any academic writing in which declaration in simple direct writing is called for. For example, obviously in a section of context building in which you're outlining either the intellectual historical context or factual, more historical context, what happened, who did what. That kind of writing should be, in a way, as crisp and as declarative as possible. And it's interesting because if you know, and if you've just, let's say in a prior chapter or in another piece of writing, have just gone through a process in which you're writing in a more complicated way, you have to be able to move between declarative and more complicated, more elusive, let's say, forms of writing in a way that is more as effective as possible. And just to give you an example, I recently had an interesting moment in something that I wrote just in the last couple of weeks, in which I wrote my first one-word sentence, maybe. And it was interesting because the sentence that came before it was somewhat of a long multi-clause sentence in which I was using semicolons and I was making a complicated point in the form of a rhetorical question, which in a way required, as rhetorical questions don't normally require an answer, but I went ahead and answered it myself in the form of a one-word sentence, maybe. And I will say, is that not quite like Oscar Wilde, but I spent a long time looking at that sentence, that one-word sentence, maybe. It was a bit jarring. In other words, we're not used to seeing one-word sentences in a piece of academic writing, but I think it works in that sentence. And in part because it softens what comes before. It is a way of using, in this case, a perhaps more informal, almost a colloquial sentence to soften the complexity of the sentence that came before it, the point that was being made before it. And I think, and one second to last thing I want to say is that there's a kind of signal when you want to simplify your writing, at least for me. When I've written a complicated sentence, not overly complicated, but one which is making points in a particular kind of way. And I feel like instinctively, the very next sentence should start with, in other words, as if I have to explain to myself, but to readers, just what came before, then that is a signal, a sign that what I've just written needs to be revised and to simplify. Not necessarily turned into a one-word sentence like maybe, but it needs to be simplified. So I have tried to get to the end of a piece of writing absolutely without having any sentence that begins with in other words. And the funny thing is that I used to think when I was writing, say, earlier in my career, that was a useful technique. In other words, to write sentences, construct paragraphs, which were so complicated and difficult to understand that they had to be then explained even by myself, even the author of the piece. For some reason, I thought that was a useful technique. Again, maybe showing the influence of the kind of things I was reading, these translations from continental social theory, in which that kind of over complexity was part of the writing. I somehow was modeling that, but I realized that that's not the best technique. That's in a way that's overdoing it, and it doesn't help the reader. It doesn't help you make the kind of capacious, inviting arguments and doing the kind of capacious and inviting writing, which I think we should be working toward. And the final thing I would say is that this sort of builds from the use of a one-word sentence is, in the end, whether it's jargon, allusion, enumeration, declaration, and there are many other categories of writing which should be part of this increased discussion of the what of academic writing. That in that, I think that the final message that I would say is think about variety. Is that in a piece of writing, an article, a book chapter, whatever, to try and use a variety of these tools to make your argument, to construct your piece of writing. That variety, and I'm not saying experiment with creative writing, although a lot of authors are starting to write in creative ways, which is very interesting. Some of it works, some of it doesn't. I'm not saying write one-word sentences or use expletives or use more colloquial, very colloquial forms of writing. All of that is completely valid. And if it comes together and few people can actually pull that off, all the better. But I think the message I would leave you with is think about your writing, think about variety in your academic writing, and think of yourself, even though you're a sociologist, an anthropologist, a geographer, or whatever you are, think about yourself and your identity as a writer, as much as an anthropologist, a sociologist, and other things. I think that would do a lot of good for ourselves in helping to orient how we see our careers, but also I think it would have important benefits for the kind of knowledge that we produce. So I'm going to end there, and we'll see you in the next workshop.